Or like the Twilight vampires sparkle. As far as I know, no other vampire had like done that before. Hello friends, my name is Morgan M. Steele. I'm an author. Today we are talking about writing monsters, specifically vampires. Because it is spooky season, and also because I'm writing a vampire anthology this year for NaNoWriMo. I've had monsters on the brain a lot lately, specifically vampires. So, as I'm sure you know, vampires appear in countless pieces of media. They have different powers, strengths, weaknesses, ways to defeat them, ways they can be created. And this changes from piece of media to piece of media. Choices were made, we're gonna talk about them. Think about how different the What We Do in the Shadows vampires are from, like, the Twilight vampires, for example. Like, they're both vampires, but they're kind of almost completely different creatures, and so there are a lot of choices that were made to get them to those different points. So we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to talk about how you can make your fictional vampires unique to you as a writer. We need to address the elephant in the room. I already have a published book about vampires. It's called O Positive. I will put the link to it down below. It looks like this. It's a cozy rom-com about vampires with a splash of "and they were roommates." So very fun. It's about this vampire named Elizabeth Bloodmere. She is 426 years old, and she gets a new roommate who is a human grad student. His name is Ben. He's 24. And it's about kind of, you know, their misadventures, the will they won't they, the pining, all of that. And they were roommates of it all. So yeah, you can pick it up. I'll put the link down below. It's in paperback and ebook. To start with, vampires and legends about them are old. When I was researching it, it looks like legends about blood-drinking creatures date back to ancient Greece, if not farther than that. So they've been around for a long time, way before Dracula. Dracula is a classic novel. It's from, I believe, the 1800s. It's by Bram Stoker. And that is where a lot of the vampire lore that we go off of today comes from, but it is not the first appearance of vampires, and there's, like, a lot of lore surrounding them, different beliefs that people have about them. There's a lot of source material to dig into. There's a lot. So it just depends on, like, the area that you want to focus on and the things that you think are important to vampires. If you're writing vampires, if you're getting into it, you need to kind of decide upon the rules that they follow, and you need to stick with these rules to keep things consistent. You need to decide a lot of these things kind of right out of the gate and you can establish them later on in the story. They don't have to be like in your first few pages, like you don't have to talk about all of this stuff, but it's good to keep in mind when you're getting started and digging in. One of the first things you should think of with your vampires is how they are created and how they are destroyed. In different forms of vampire media, different things occur to create vampires. Usually it's like a transfer of blood. In the Vampire Diaries specifically, if you die and you have vampire blood in your body, you are resurrected as a vampire. Sometimes it's like a transfer of blood where it's like you drink their blood, they drink your blood, like that kind of thing. That can turn you into a vampire. Sometimes there's like a magic ritual. When I was looking into it, apparently, people believed that if a cat jumped over your corpse, you would come back as a vampire, which I think is so delightful. I've never read that in anything before. Someone please do this. I think it would be so great. Sometimes vampires are born instead of created, so specifically some of my vampires we'll get into later are born and some are created. Can you have vampires that are born in your reality, or do they have to be created by another vampire? And then if there are vampire hybrids like Renesmee and Twilight, what are their rules? That's like a whole separate thing. There could be a whole separate video on like hybrid monsters and whatnot. And then you have to think about how your vampires can be killed. Typically this can be done with like a wooden stake, a little stroll in the sunshine. Some vampires are very fragile and some vampires are very difficult to kill. For example, the What We Do in the Shadows vampires. If you open a window, they are dead, you know what I mean? The What We Do in the Shadows vampires, they are very weak to sunshine. They cannot go in the sunshine. They turn into a pile of ash. Very easy to kill. Wooden stakes to the heart will usually do it. With the Twilight vampires, you have to dismember them. You have to rip them into pieces and throw all the pieces into a fire. I think that's a little extreme. I think that is like level 10 vampires. That's like a very hard vampire to kill. You can't just do it with a chunk of wood. Like, you have to, it's a whole process. So I think that is really difficult. I think a lot of this comes down to, like, your plot. Like, do you have vampire slayers in this world? And how fragile, kind of, do you want your vampires to be? Do you want them to be kind of, in between? Because vampires, theoretically, live forever. But they could have kind of a short lifespan if anything can do them in, you know what I mean? So that's one thing you have to think about. I think that is very, like, it's a plot decision more than anything, how easy you want them to be to destroy. Some other, like, methods of killing vampires are usually, like, decapitation, like taking their head off will do it, or fire, like, just fire in general. You should also take into consideration if vampirism can be cured in your world, if there is a cure. Because that would be a way to, like, destroy a vampire, quote unquote, is if you, like, turn them human. And I guess, does the cure involve turning them to their, like, physical human age? Because that would kill a lot of them if you're, like, 2,000 years old and you turn human suddenly and you turn into a pile of dust, like, that could theoretically kill them. You should also think about, like, all of the classic vampire tropes and whether or not you are going to adhere to these things. So, like, how does garlic affect your vampires? Can they eat it? Are they repelled by it? In The Sims 4, vampires, they aren't killed by garlic, but if there's garlic around, they can't feed, which I think is really interesting. Do they have a reflection or not? Like, can they be seen in mirrors? Can they be seen on film? Can they be seen in, like, a water reflection? The reason for, like, vampires not having a reflection was because older vintage mirrors were backed with silver, and silver was seen as, like, this pure metal, which is also why some vampires have silver allergies. Like, if they touch silver, like, smoke, like, they start burning, like, they burn at the touch of silver. That's why. Because it was seen as, like, a holy metal. It was like a pure metal. And so vampires, because they're typically seen as, like, satanic, they are weak to this kind of thing. That is why. So, like, the mirrors were backed with silver, and then they were so unholy that they could not be seen in the mirrors. So that's where that comes from. I think it's really neat if you, like, if they can't be seen in, like, vintage mirrors, but they can be seen in, like, more recent mirrors, like modern mirrors. I think that's a really interesting piece of world building. I also think you should think about, like, cameras. Like, do the old film cameras not show the vampires, but, like, digital cameras will pick them up? That's something you can think about as well. And then also, there's the relationship with, like, Catholicism and also, like, religion in general, like Christianity specifically. Can they go in churches without bursting into flames? Do crucifixes have any effect on them? These are all things, this whole list is all things that we see specifically in What We Do in the Shadows. Taika plays into, like, every vampire trope there is. Also can they enter a property with or without permission, like that kind of thing. I think it's also really interesting how the Vampire Diaries handles these things, because vampires cannot enter households unless they are invited in or if they own the property. The Vampire Diaries really gets into, like, a lot more than you would think for being, like, a cheesy CW show, but they take their vampires mostly seriously, pretty seriously. I don't think they're allergic to garlic. They can't walk in the sun, but they do have, like, sunlight rings.
Take it off. I can put it in my bag.
No, it's fine. Really. Thanks, though.
Okay.
Which I think is a really interesting way to get around that problem, to have, like, witches create rings for them. But if they don't have the rings or another piece of enchanted jewelry on, then they do burn alive in the sun, like we see with Elena's biological mother. That's a whole dramatic thing, Do your vampires, do they sleep at all? Do they sleep during the day? Do they sleep in a coffin? That whole thing. Edward Cullen doesn't even have a bed in his room because he is one of the kinds that doesn't sleep at all. With the Vampire Diaries vampires, I believe they do sleep just like normal humans during the nighttime, which is interesting. The next big thing is blood and their relationship to it, specifically how often they need to feed, how much blood they need to drink. Can they drink like an animal alternative and go vegetarian like Edward Cullen? Or does it have to be like human blood? Does something happen to them? Do they get weird side effects if they drink animal blood? Like, do they get indigestion or something like that? Weird side effects. Also, what happens if they drink tainted blood? Like, For example,
Drank the blood of some people, but the people want drugs. And now I'm a wizard.
can your vampires eat human food as well as drinking blood? Like, some vampires can eat human food, and then they also need to drink blood, like, on the side, but they eat the human food for fun. There's that. Some vampires cannot eat human food at all.
Bring pizza pie.
Oh, no.
The garlic burnt a little, but...
And then some vampires, the Twilight vampires, I believe this is in Midnight Sun, Edward takes like a tiny bite of pizza and then he has to puke it up later because there's nothing going on in here. He doesn't have any body, like, chemicals, you know? There's no stomach acid in there, there's no bodily fluid. He can't, like, digest food anymore, so he has to, like, puke it up later because it just, like, sits in there. Vampires also typically have powers of some kind. This can be, like, mind control, like, what is it, compulsion in the Vampire Diaries, where they can control you to do basically anything, to forget anything, like, all of that kind of stuff. Strength and speed I see as kind of baseline. Like, most vampires have super strength and super speed. Some of them have psychic powers, some of them can read your mind, like Edward Cullen. Some of them have, like, the Twilight vampires specifically have really weird powers, especially in Breaking Dawn. Like, you get all the vampires from all over the world and they have, like, wild powers. The one guy, Rami Malek, love you, sir, who just has, like, elemental powers. Like, he literally is just the Avatar and also a vampire for some reason. And then Bella, who can, like, block all the others' powers. Edward can read minds. Jane can do that, like, pain thing.
Pain.
And, like, put you in pain. And her brother has, like, pain mist? I think it's pain mist. I don't remember if it's just, like, normal mist or if it, like, hurts you. It's interesting. Vampires typically can, like, turn into bats. They can travel by mist. They can, like, teleport, kind of. Can they fly? Can they climb up walls like Spider-Man? Can they hoist a car over their head? Like, what is the limit of this strength? You know what I mean? Does it get stronger when they drink? Like, that kind of thing. If you have other creatures in your lore as well, werewolves, witches, monster hunters, what have you, mermaids, fairies, you know, whatever you have, how do they interact with the vampires? Do they have weird beef with the vampires? Are they friends? Does it vary coven to coven? Do they have covens? I feel like that's a good question as well. Do your vampires travel with other vampires? Do they live with other vampires? Or are they, like, kind of solitary creatures? Like, maybe this coven of vampires is chill with the werewolves. Maybe they're chill with one pack of werewolves, but not another pack of werewolves. On the topic of other creatures, what happens if a vampire tries to turn another creature into a vampire? Like, what if your vampire tries to turn a witch into a vampire? Is the witch blood poisonous to the vampire? Does the venom work at all on the witch? Is she just, like, immune to it? Can she become what Damon from the Vampire Diaries would call a witch-pyre? Same with werewolves. Like, are there hybrids? Does one type of blood beat out the other type of blood? Is the vampire venom poisonous to the werewolf? Does it just kill the werewolf instead of turning them? Is the werewolf blood poisonous to the vampire? You don't have to get into this in your book, but I feel like you should give some thought as to where your vampires come from. How did vampires come to be? Like, are they from a specific place? Were they born vampires and they just exist? Was it, like, some god or goddess that created them? Is vampirism a punishment or a gift? That, I think, is something really important to think about, because that kind of frames maybe how your vampires view themselves. Do they think that they are cursed? Do they, like, internalize their vampirism and they're like, oh, woe is me, like Edward Cullen? Or do they see this as, like, a gift that they've been given, like something that they can use to be stronger, or something that, like, makes them better than other people or creatures? Is this a disease? One take I've seen that I really like is, like, vampirism as, like, an STD almost, where, like, you have an encounter with a vampire and you may or may not get it, and I think that is really interesting, especially when you bring, like, college vampires into the picture. I think that could be, you know, that's really interesting to explore. Point is, you can do whatever you want with your vampires. If you go somewhere completely different than this whole list, like, that is totally fine too. Like the Vampire Diaries introduced vervain as like a vampire herb. It's real. It like does exist. It's a flower. But, you know, they introduced the relationship that vampires have with vervain in that show kind of as a stand-in to garlic, which I think is really interesting. You could totally do that with a different plant. You totally could have them have a weird relationship with something else, you know? Or like the Twilight vampires sparkle. As far as I know, no other vampire had like done that before. So you can really do anything you want with your vampires. You can make them totally unique to you. You can have fun, you can explore. These are mythical creatures, like you can be kind of creative with them. And then because NaNoWriMo is coming up and I am writing more vampires, I did want to get into my own vampire lore just to kind of show you what I have done with my vampires. Maybe to help give you some ideas of what to do with yours, maybe to serve as a jumping off point for you. But yeah, this is where I have gone with mine. So I have 3 tiers of vampires. There are the pureblood vampires, which are vampires that were born vampires. They come from a country in my like magical kingdom planet thing called the Bloodwind Isles. Some of them live in Resenserae, so like specifically Elizabeth's family from O Positive, Elizabeth Bloodmere. Her family is from Resenserae. They lived in the city square and then they moved to our planet, which is seen as like another realm. It's like, it is a separate planet. I'm getting into that in like another writing project, but it's seen as like another realm. Like you step through a portal, suddenly you're here, like that kind of thing. So they came over from Resenserae in, I want to say like the 1500s, and they have lived on Earth ever since. They live in Europe. I don't know exactly where. I haven't figured that out yet, but Elizabeth was born a vampire. She grew up, she aged into a young adult, and that is where her aging has kind of stopped. I picture her around like 26-ish, 27, like late 20s. That's kind of where her aging has stopped. Pureblood vampires, they kind of do continue to age a little bit as they get older and older, but it's like very, very slow. Elizabeth is 426 years old. She only looks like she's 26 years old. But she has parents, and they appear to be like in their middle ages, like 40, 50-ish, but they are like 1,000 years old. So, to give you some idea, they can procreate with other vampires, they can like birth their own vampires, and they can also turn people into vampires. So my pureblood vampires, they don't really have any of the weird side effects. They can eat human food, they can eat garlic, they can go in the sun, they're like daywalkers. They get cool powers, but it goes by bloodline. So like the Bloodmere vampires have what's called Siren's Venom, which makes their victims like having their blood drained, so it makes it easier for them to feed. The Valentine vampires have mind control. Yes, they have mind control, and then the Edwards vampires have the ability to mess with your memories. So I wanted to focus on like kind of psychic abilities. When I get into more vampire bloodlines, I will introduce like kind of more powers. Like maybe one family can make you see things that aren't there, and one family can read minds, like that whole kind of thing. But I didn't want it to be like the Twilight vampires where it's just like crazy random powers. Like I wanted them to be kind of grounded, like, yeah, this seems like a vampire power, not just like Rami Malek, the Avatar vampire, you know what I mean? Yeah, so it's by bloodline, and it's only pureblood vampires. The legacy vampires, which are the vampires that they create, might have like a sliver of their power, but they don't really get powers, and then anything beyond that, which we will get into in a second, they don't have powers at all, aside from like strength and speed. All of my vampires have strength and speed across the board. My pureblood vampires, they can only be killed by an enchanted wooden stake. It has to be enchanted by a witch. I feel like dismemberment would also work. I haven't, like, gotten into that in my books. Like, no one's been decapitated or anything like that. I feel like that would work on them, though. I feel like that would also kill them. But, like, a normal wooden stake wouldn't do it. They would heal from that wound. It has to be, like, special wood enchanted by a special kind of witch. So they're pretty hard to kill unless you're in good with those witches. And then, yeah, they can eat human food, they can sleep. They don't need very much sleep. Elizabeth, one of the whole plot points is her roommate is like, wow, she, like, kind of doesn't sleep. If she's really wiped out, she might, like, actually genuinely sleep. But usually she doesn't sleep, like, basically at all. She might take a little nap, like I said, but that's kind of it. She just doesn't really need it unless, you know, it's been a long day. and she can sleep. She can, like, choose to sleep, but she, you know, doesn't need to like humans do. and she can eat human food. She cooks a lot. Their senses are a little bit different. So like specifically taste, like her taste is dulled because she doesn't need to eat food. So she can taste like really spicy stuff, really sweet stuff, really sour stuff. Anything else is just kind of in the gray area in the middle. I feel like she would be able to taste really bitter stuff too. Like all of the really extreme flavors she can taste. Anything else is going to be kind of muddled to her. So she cooks a lot of spicy food. And then finally, they do have like mates, like fated mates, like a fated mate situation where like they drink someone's blood and they're like, this is my mate, oh my god, like that kind of thing. Or they meet another vampire and it's just, like Hotel Transylvania, like the Zing. That is what my pureblood vampires have. They can create vampires with their venom, and these vampires are called legacy vampires. So legacy vampires are basically the same as pureblood vampires. They are a little weaker. Like I said, they don't really have cool powers, but they have strength and speed. They still need to drink blood. They have a little bit harder of a time controlling their bloodlust than pureblood vampires. That's kind of it. They stop aging. So pureblood vampires will still age very, very, very slowly for the rest of their lives. Legacy vampires don't. Because they are undead, whereas pureblood vampires are still like alive. Because they're undead, they freeze. They like stop aging altogether. The problem occurs, however, when legacy vampires try to turn other people into vampires. And that is where we get diluted vampires. So the name comes from the fact that the venom is being passed down the line. By the time the venom gets to them, like legacy vampires can't really make their own venom. It's not their venom. It's just like in them. And so the amount that they pass on is very little because it's not theirs. So this is just like residual venom that didn't go into like their own creation. It's just like kind of bopping around. If they give it to someone else, they become a diluted vampire. And diluted vampires are the ones that have all the fun, funky side effects. They cannot walk in the sun. They will die. They will burn in the sun. They can be killed by any wooden stake. They probably can't go in churches. I didn't really give that much thought, but they probably can't go in churches. They can't enter houses without being invited. They can't eat garlic. Garlic repels them. Like, all of those things, they don't have reflections. They don't show up on camera. Like, all of these things apply to the diluted vampires. So, theoretically, the diluted vampires could live forever, but they have a very short lifespan because it is so easy to kill them. Like, you open the door and the sun comes in and they're dust. Like, that's it. So, they could live forever if they found a place to hide, someone to take care of them, but they're very easy to kill. So they're not, they're not very common unless they were just made to be, like, cannon fodder in a vampire war. Like, for example, the vampires in Eclipse, where Victoria is, like, making a newborn army, like, that whole thing, that is what diluted vampires are in my universe. They just are made to serve a purpose and then die. And that's what I want to get into in my vampire anthology. Those are the vampires that I want to write about and how f***ed up that is that happens to them, and also kind of their quest like for a cure to like figure out what's going on with them and to figure out that as a whole. So that's why I want to write this anthology, because when I was writing O Positive, and I love O Positive, I love O Positive so much, I had such a fun time with it, but they are such cozy vampires. Like, there's no weird side effects, there's none of that kind of stuff, and I was watching, What We Do in the Shadows, and I was like, these are vampires. These are fun vampires. I love my vampires. I love Elizabeth. I love O Positive. But I wanted to have vampires that were just a little bit f***ed up. So I'm writing my anthology. I'm very excited about it. It's going to be very fun. I'm going to talk about it a lot more in probably December when I'm done writing it. And we'll unpack all of that together. Anyway, I think those are my thoughts for the time being. Originally, when I was writing this video, it was going to be vampires, werewolves, ghosts, and then I sat down to write it, and I have vampire brain rot, and so it turned out to be like 2,000 words of a script. I was like, that is a video on its own. I'll have to come back to the other guys later. So someday I will talk about ghosts and werewolves and monster hunters and witches and like all of the other fun stuff that I love writing. But today we're just talking about vampires, and that's totally okay. Who are your favorite vampires? Are you a Vampire Diaries girly? Are you a What We Do in the Shadows girly? Are you a Twilight girly? No shame. It's Twilight season. Who are your favorite kind of vampires? Do you write vampires? What are your vampires like? Do they have cool lore? Like, what's going on with them? All of that fun stuff. Let me know in the comments down below. That's gonna be it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Have a lovely rest of your day. And as always, take your meds, drink your water, and I'll see you next week.